Hello everybody, hei alle sammen. Welcome to this event. My name is Agnete Haaland, and on behalf of the board of PEN Norway, I'm saying welcome to all of you, and this has been filmed, so also welcome to those of you who are not present. Well, it's the war. The war is not over yet. That is the title of today's event. And the reason why we're having this event is, of course, there is a war, but it's also that Norwegian PEN is celebrating 100 years this year. PEN stands for poets, essayists, and novelists. So it's an organization who celebrates literature and fights for freedom of expression. And the program for the festival is on the chairs. It's blue, so please bring it home and welcome back to some of the other events as well. We're going to keep on having great events all the way until November 15th. So welcome back also. And also very welcome to support our work and become a member. If you use your voice and if you defend others who also use their voices, even though you don't always agree with them. And I'm going to give the floor to today's one of today's honorary guests, Maksym Sytnikov. He is from PEN Ukraine. I'm very happy that he is here. This is his first time outside the country since the war started. And he had to really go through a whole process to be allowed to leave the country. He's going back. And he's going to take us through as an exhibition that has been made on the war and the effects of the war. And we're very happy you're here, very happy you're not drafted. It makes me very sort of moved to see you, because I know you are in the age where they don't really want to let you go. But he was allowed to come, and he's also going back. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for invitation to be here. My name is Maksym Sytnikov. I'm a human rights officer at PEN Ukraine and also journalist. And also I'm one of the authors of this photo exhibition, which is called "The War is Not Over Yet." And I will briefly tell you the story of this exhibition and how it started. So it was March 2022. We were in Lviv. I mean PEN Ukraine team. We were relocated to the west of the country from Kyiv because of security reasons. And being in Lviv, we decided to make a photo exhibition in the city center next to the media center where many foreign journalists worked. And the first name of the exhibition was Call the War a War, because there was and still there is a problem with a proper naming of what is happening in Ukraine. Many international media writing about conflict, crisis, military operation of Russia, or etc., etc. It is not correct, and it hurts us very much. We ask everyone to call the war of Russia against Ukraine is a war. So this was our opening ceremony of the exhibition in Lviv in March. The aim of the exhibition is first to pay attention of international community about events in Ukraine. The second is to express our solidarity with journalists who are working in Ukraine and who are covering the war and risking their lives in the everyday basis. And the third is to commemorate those journalists who lost their lives because of the war. Then in June we were back to Kyiv, and we decided to change the name of the exhibition. It became "The War is Not Over Yet," because in June we saw that the decrease of the interest of international media for Ukraine, and that is why we underlined that the war is not over, and ask to continue to cover the war. This was opening in Kyiv. Then our exhibition moved to the city of Boyarka when one of the journalists who died, he was living there. It is Max Levin. I will tell his story a bit later. And then exhibition was in Vinnytsia, and currently it is in Odessa, in the south of Ukraine. So these two guys are the first victims of the Russia's war among journalists. They are Danish reporters from Ekstrabladet media, Stefan Weichert and Emil Filtenberg. They survived the attack on their car. Unknown man opened a fire on their car. The car was signed with big letters TV. It was in Ochtyrka on the north of Ukraine, where Russian attacked Ukraine from that side. Yeah, they survived. They were taken to hospital, and they are okay now. This is Stuart Ramsey from Sky News. He's a British reporter. On this picture, he shows a car which he was driving during the attack of Russians near the village of Stoyanka in February 28. He was with his colleagues. They were in five. When their car stopped near the checkpoint, Russian occupiers began firing at it without any warning. And Stuart Ramsey was wounded in back. And this picture was taken in May, I think, when he came to Ukraine again. And this is Guillaume Briquet. He's an independent Swiss reporter. On March 6, he was driving this car with a large sign press, and when he was in the Mykolaiv region in the south of Ukraine, and he was stopped by Russian occupiers. Russians opened a fire against him. Then they robbed him, took away his cell phone, his photo camera, his laptop, and money. All of them, Guillaume Briquet, Stuart Ramsey, Stefan Weichert, and Emil Filtenberg, they survived. But the first victim of the first journalist who died as a result of Russian shelling was Yevgen Sakun. He's a cameraman of Live channel. He was killed during the work. He was filming. He was filming near the Kyiv TV tower. And on the 1st of March, Kyiv TV tower was shelled, and Russian rocket killed 5 civilians. Among them was Yevgen Sakun. And it is important to say that since the beginning of full-scale war, Russians deliberately shell TV towers in different regions in Ukraine. We have at least 19 cases from different regions because they are afraid of spreading information, and it is in common when they enter Ukrainian cities. They firstly attack this radio or TV towers, enter to studios and starting to operate their propaganda from there. The next case is Brent Renaud. On March 13, he was killed. He's a famous American journalist director, producer. He was working on a documentary about refugees in Ukraine, and he was filming in the city of Irpin, near Kiev. And he was working together with Juan Arredondo, his cameraman. Juan survived, he was wounded, but unfortunately Brent Renault was killed. Their car came under Russian fire. And this is Fox News cameraman Pierre Zakrzewski and journalist Oleksandra Kuvshinova. They were killed on March 15 in the village of Horenka near Kyiv. Pierre Zakrzewski was a very experienced cameraman. He was working in very dangerous areas around the world. Yeah, he was covering in Afghanistan, in Syria. And Oleksandra Kuvshinova was very young, only 24-year-old. She was a fixer for Fox News team. And along with Zakrzewski and Kuvshinova was Fox News correspondent Benjamin Hall was heavily wounded. He lost his legs and one eye. And this is Oksana Baulina. She's a journalist from a Russian opposition newspaper, The Insider. And she was also killed by Russian rocket in Kyiv on March 23. And this is very symbolic that Russian rocket kills Russian citizen. And this is prominent Lithuanian documentarian Mantas Kvedravičius, who was killed in occupied Mariupol on April 3. Mantas was abducted by Russian military when he tried to help to escape civilians from the city. And the reason for his detention was his Lithuanian passports. So he he's a citizen of Lithuania, and the occupiers killed him because he is Lithuanian. His body was found by his wife with a gunshot wound. And this is a French BFM-TV journalist Frédéric Leclerc-Imanhoff, who died due to Russian artillery strike on May 30 in Luhansk region. He received a wound in his neck, and he was also covering the evacuation of civilians together with two other representatives of BFM-TV channel. Who fortunately survived the attack. And this is last photo of prominent Ukrainian photo correspondent Max Levin. Max Levin was working as photo correspondent for many well-known foreign media such as Reuters, BBC, Associated Press, Wall Street Journal, Time, etc., etc. He was covering the war in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts since 2014. And of course, he was also covering the full-scale invasion until March 13, when he was lost in Kyiv region. He went by car there to film the fights, and his body was found only on April 1st, after the liberation of Kyiv region from Russians. And yeah, this is his car. And in June 2022, Reporters Without Borders released the result of their investigation into the death of Max Levin. And the information and evidence indicate that Russian military executed him. At least 11 journalists among 42 who were killed since the beginning of full-scale Russia's war have become become civilian victims of Russia. Many of them were killed during shellings or be shot or tortured and killed. And among them is Roman Nezhiborets, who is a local Chernihiv, who worked for a Chernihiv media TV channel. He was last seen on March 5. Then Russians took to his home, abducted him, and since that time his whereabouts were unknown until the liberation of Chernihiv region. And his body was found with a gunshot in the back, and neck, and his hands were tied behind his back. And this is a photo of him and his family. And another case of journalists who died as civilian is Vera Hyrich, who was producer of Radio Liberty. She died as a result of Russian attack on her home. This is a residential building when she lived. She died on April 28. She decided to stay in Kiev and work and work from Kiev. She also volunteering in that time. One more story. This is a story of journalists who decided to join armed forces of Ukraine after the beginning of invasion. His name is Oleksandra Hrybenko. He was born in Luhansk region, and since 2014 he was a war correspondent, worked for Ukrainian TV channels Ukraina 24, and he was covering the war in Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts since 2014. And on the first day of Russia's full-scale war, he decided to join Ukrainian army, and he even had call sign journalist in army. And he was killed on May 4 near Izium in Kharkiv region. Izium is now liberated from Russians. And also, Oleksandr Machov was engaged with journalist, correspondent Anastasia Blishchik. And after his death, Anastasia left her job and also joined armed forces. We know also many cases of kidnapping journalists, of journalists who are currently missing, and our exhibition covers these cases also. In the end, I would like to say thank you for Norway, for people of Norway, for your support, for your solidarity, because this is what we need, and this is what helps us to live in such dark times. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us telling us about the reality and giving us the backdrop for this conversation. You may have a seat here on stage, please, because Hege Moe Eriksen, a highly profiled anchor and journalist from NRK, is going to moderate this conversation, and she will introduce the guests. Just for your information, the whole event will last about 1 hour, and at the end of the conversation, she will open up for questions from you. I mean, we are a freedom of expression organization, so of course we also want you to be able to express yourselves. So Hege Moe Eriksen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Oleksandra, you can come as well and have a seat. So I have to say that actually I think it's almost difficult to continue after this presentation, because it really makes a huge impression to see the faces of all these colleagues that have lost their lives in the war. on the 23rd of February, when Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, the journalists in Ukraine found themselves in the middle of the world's biggest story. And Maksym, as you mentioned, now 8 months later, 42 journalists have been killed, and many more risk their lives every day in fighting for the truth. So I'm really happy to have two of them with us today. As we heard, Maksym Sytnikov, you are a human rights activist and a journalist, and Oleksandra Hrybenko, you are a journalist and a fixer. You have even worked with Norwegian journalists, and you are now working on your PhD at Oslo Met. So, really a warm welcome to you both. Maksym, I'm just curious because you left Kyiv just 2 days ago or something, and how is it to be outside of a war zone in Oslo right now?
Well, it is a very interesting feeling. It's my first time abroad since the start of full-scale war, and I feel safety here. Finally, it's like a basic human need to feel safety, and Ukrainians don't have this safety anymore, and it is probably the biggest challenge for everyone to live in such circumstances, in such times. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here with you and to be in Norway, particularly in Norway, who supports Ukraine. We are very grateful for your support of our people, of government, of media. Very appreciated.
Thank you. As a part of your work in PEN, you have actually traveled around in Ukraine, documenting atrocities, war crimes. Could you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes. So after 24th of February, the work of PEN Ukraine has completely changed because all our projects were stopped in a moment, and we were moving from Kyiv to Lviv. Some of our colleagues left the country and working from abroad. And we just were thinking about what to do, and basically the first thing we did, we started our international newsletter for all PEN centers, informing about Ukraine, about the war. And then being in Lviv, we just invented many new projects about the war, about atrocities of Russia, about Russia's crimes, and then after Ukrainian army liberated areas where Russian occupiers were, we started volunteering trips, volunteering and cultural trips with our PEN Ukraine writers and journalists. And in this, I believe there were 4 or 5 such trips, and I was on the last trip to Kharkiv region, to Izium, just 2 weeks ago, I think. And in Izium we saw what Russians left after them. We saw these destroyed cities. We saw these mass graves in the forests. We spoke to the people who lost their relatives, whose relatives died in front of them. And we heard a lot of terrible stories. And one of the purposes of our visit Izium was writer Volodymyr Vakulenko, who's a children's writer, and he was abducted by Russians during the occupation in March. And unfortunately, his whereabouts are still unknown, despite that his village near Izum is liberated. But we still don't know where is him. And we believe that he is in captivity in Russia, but still there is a lack of information about him.
But you actually went and saw a mass grave. Can you tell us what you saw there?
We saw this grave. It is located in the forest near Izum. We saw it after the exhumation of bodies. There were 447 of them, mostly civilians, children, adults, elderly people. Most of them with signs of torture. Only 17, I think, as I remember, only 17 of them were soldiers, and the rest of them were just civilians. And it is horrible. It is absolutely many of graves are unknown. It's very hard to describe not seeing this or not being there. It is just something that impossible to believe that it is reality and that is happening.
And I just want to ask you a bit more regarding these trips, because it's very interesting. Because when these occupied territories are liberated from the Russians, you actually go in there and you document the abuses and the war crimes committed by the Russians. What else have you experienced on these trips? What has made an impression on you?
We also meet local volunteers who stayed during the occupation, or who were near the front line, who are very active and who help local people. We also take some aid for civilians. We take books, because there is big problems with books in the occupied areas. As probably you know, Russians take away all Ukrainian literature from libraries when they occupy some village, and they even burn these books or just take away and throw them. There is a need of Ukrainian literature there. There is a need of humanitarian aid, and also we take something for our soldiers who are fighting next to these territories.
But just to be clear, do you feel that there is a systematic attempt of erasing Ukrainian culture?
Of course. Russian aim is to erase all Ukrainian. And it is not new. It is what's happening in Ukraine since 2014. Because the war of Russia against Ukraine not started in 2022. It has started in 2014. From the occupation of Crimea, from the occupation of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and we saw what they are doing there on the territories. We saw that their aim is just to make these territories Russia, and with of course abducting of all Ukrainian people who are speaking Ukrainian language, who identify itself as Ukrainians, to abduct them, to torture them, to kill them, to throw away all Ukrainian signs, all Ukrainian books. And yes, it is a war against Ukrainian identity, against Ukrainian existence.
How? I mean, I know it's difficult. Can you try to describe how is it to travel across your own country and see this devastation?
It hurts. But in the same time, it has big impact on after you see this, you understand, you have better understanding of Russians, better understanding of your enemy, because when you enter the school, which used to be a school before Russians, and you see all these destructions, all these signs on the walls. You just understand that we are fighting against sick nation. I don't have another words. They are just sick, crazy.
I want to take a step back because Oleksandra, you used to work as a journalist and a fixer at a time where we in NRK labeled the war as the forgotten war of Ukraine. That is after 2014, before the full-scale invasion of Russia. Can you tell us a little bit, you worked mainly in the Donbass area. Could you tell us a little bit about how it was?
Sure. Can you hear me well? Yes, I myself am from Donetsk. The part of my region was occupied in 2014, so very early on, and I've had an opportunity to see how is it to live under occupation, as I stayed in my city and worked with international media while they were still allowed for about 3 years. I was working both on the occupied territories and on the government-controlled Ukrainian territories. It was in the very beginning of the war, 2014-15, was less censorship. I would say they were still trying, the Russians were still allowing international journalists to come and see something, because they were still playing a game that's we are liberating Russian speaking or whatever their lies they're saying. They were still playing this game. They were trying to seem good. But that changed very quickly because everybody could see the truth. And of course, when I left Donetsk in 2018, there was already no way that they would allow journalists who are critical to come and report from the occupied territories. And of course, there were also no Ukrainian journalists there because they were either abducted while trying to report. Some of the colleagues from the area were abducted and imprisoned in secret prisons for years after reporting in the city. So it was very dangerous. We were arrested many times with international media, questioned. But of course, right now, the situation is 1,000 times worse. But you also received threats, you told me. What kind of measures did they use against journalists at that time? Well, they can't really use many measures against international journalists because at least back then they were scared of ruining their international reputation or whatever. So the most common measure they would use is just to ban them. As soon as they publish anything critical, they're banned from entry to the occupied territories. Or they wouldn't allow them to go and see things they want to see, for instance. Regarding local journalists, of course, and fixers like me, measures were much more harsh. Some of my colleagues, as I mentioned, were in prison. Some of them were banned from living in their home, so they were kicked out. I received personally direct threats that if you will not stop working, we will make you stop. So I had to leave eventually. And I'm curious, how did you feel about the media coverage at that time, the international attention given to this war? It was difficult. Many of my colleagues now say it's much easier to report on this war because there is no more pretense. Everybody understands who is a bad guy, who is a good guy, who is being attacked. Well, almost everyone, right? And thank you, Maksym, for what you mentioned. It's very important to pay attention, and I keep saying that to all the journalists I meet. You need to write the correct words in your articles and say that it's war, it's not a special operation, and because the Russians have been using these unclear names for this war, and many international media also picked them up, and like for not even just the war, referendums. Just recently we saw I think AP or some other international media called not sham referendums but just referendums or elections, which is very unprecedented situation, honestly.
So there is still a war of information, a war of opinion. Yeah, there is still a war on information, and it's stronger than it ever was, because in this war, independent journalists are fighting as important war as military on the ground. So yeah, I would say some people are still not clear on the words.
I would say it is also cultural war. It is also diplomatic war. The war is on every stage. Every stage in relations with Russia, there is a war of Ukraine against them. And it's absolutely understandable that when someone attempts to kill and erase you, that you will fight against him.
So what would you say then? How do you work in order to document the truth in a stream of propaganda and fake news?
We just live inside and we see on our own eyes what is happening with us, and it is not so hard to to see what is true or what is not true regarding the war, because it is it is not a normal life of many shadows, of many different opinions. The war is very simple. There is black and there is a white side, and you just decide what side you will choose, and that's it.
Oleksandra, how important is the role of journalists in this war right now?
As I mentioned, it's crucial, because Russia is leading a very dirty war, and we see that it's not news, actually. Since 2014, I already saw in Donetsk Ukrainian history books in schools that were in the basement and were exchanged to Russian history books. And I also remember very vividly once standing in Donetsk, reporting actually with Norwegian media, and as soon as something was hit in the city, the propaganda media would come and start filming people and say, so they start saying, oh, it's Ukrainians who bombed us, we're poor Russian-speaking population here. And then they film that. They find one or two people to say these things, while the rest of the local people, they say, it's you who came here and it's you who killing us, not Ukrainians. It's because of you we're suffering. And of course, all their cameras are turned off. So, of course, the work of journalist is as important as the work of soldier now, as important as the work of doctor now, and it also has a great impact on the health and situation for journalists, because they're working without caring for themselves. They're burnt out. There are a huge range of threats, not just physical, of course physical as well, but also psychological, financial. A lot of infrastructure was destroyed. Many journalists lost their jobs because the only job right now is to report on the war in Ukraine. You cannot report on anything else, of course. So there are really many threats, but Ukrainian journalists, as Ukrainian people, are very brave and they persevere. But we only can do that if there is enough support.
Maksym, I mean, obviously it's dangerous for everybody in Ukraine right now, but what would you say related to what Oleksandra is saying about threats to journalists, the risks they are taking every day? What can you tell about that?
I think you saw everything on the presentation, and this is what we are dealing with. It's deliberate shelling of journalists. It's deliberate abductions of journalists in occupied territories. We also have we still have journalists who were arrested after 2014 in Crimea, and they are still in jail or in Crimea or in Russia, and yeah, we're trying to help them as well as a human rights organization. Make some events, programs, empty chair days, etc. But the only way to help them is to support Ukrainian army and to help Ukrainian army to liberate these areas as soon as possible and to make these people free.
Mm. Yeah, because what can you tell us about how journalists are treated in the occupied areas and how they were treated in the previously occupied areas?
It's almost the same. If Russians enter the city, they almost they usually have a list of activists, of journalists, of famous people in this area, and firstly they try to negotiate with them and to make them these journalists work with occupiers. If they are denied, then they have two choices, or to leave this territory or to be imprisoned. And unfortunately, many journalists are imprisoned in newly occupied territories and in occupied territories from 2014. And some of the journalists are released. We have such cases as well in Kherson, for example. Yeah.
But are they being forced then by the Russians to publish their narrative?
Yes, of course. They are forced, and unfortunately some of them agree to cooperate, and this is not good for them, of course. But you know, in the war, I can judge anyone. I'm not on their shoes, and I cannot even imagine how it is to be under occupation. I will not say bad about them, but it is just impossible to create independent journalism under the occupation. It is, you just work for propaganda, or you do not work.
Just to add to that, and a very terrifying thing also, and since February there were also such cases, when journalists leave. They know the occupation is coming, that the Russian soldiers are close, they leave. But if their family members left behind, they're being threatened. Even if they're already safe, the journalists themselves, they get calls from Russians and say, okay, you continue publishing critical things, we will do something to your father here, or something like that. So there were already cases like that, and they were also, so many have to self-censor, even if they're safe, but they have to self-censor not to hurt, so the Russians wouldn't hurt their families.
So journalists are particularly targeted by the Russians. Oleksandra, you are working on a PhD on female fixers and journalists. Are they exposed to any particular risk, being a woman?
Yes, of course they are exposed to the same risks that their male colleagues. But on the top, of course, they're also exposed to gendered risks, and which are not, all of them are very severe, but it makes their work harder For instance, trying to negotiate access as a woman to the front line, it's hard because you have to persuade some kind of macho commander to let you go, and other things. But it makes it more complicated. And now also additionally, many women journalists who I know, their husbands went to fight, and they have to both combine, responsibility of taking care of their children, of their families, and doing journalism. So that's also quite difficult. But there are many different aspects of security in Ukraine.
Mm. And you say many have, for example, husbands or wives who are in the army, and I'm just wondering, I mean, I feel it's like you feel this is a very difficult question, I feel, because how do you view journalistic virtues such as objectivity, neutrality, when your own existence is threatened, your own country is threatened? I mean, is there such a thing as a neutral or objective journalist in Ukraine right now, Maksym?
Yes, it is very hard to be objective in such circumstances, but once again, we have a clear understanding of who we are and why we are, and what we are fighting for, and why we are fighting, and what is this war is about. And probably this helps to do our job and to do it in professional way with standards. And it is very simple to say the truth, to say what you see, to talk to people and with and properly understand what are they saying you, with having the context of the situation. So of course for Ukrainian journalists it is easier to cover this war because they are fully in context. Regarding objectivity, I don't know that I'm not sure that we don't have such thing as war propaganda, for example, in Ukraine, because we have freedom of speech in such circumstances. We can criticize our government, our president, even during the wartime, and the journalists are doing this, and it is very clear. It shows that Ukraine is democratic, and Ukraine is fighting for democracy, for freedom of speech, and for not being Russia.
Oleksandra, what do you think?
Well, I would definitely disagree that we do have war propaganda, and especially on the TV. But at the same time, when you're
you disagree on the war propaganda thing?
Yeah, we do have war propaganda on TV, but in a way that it exists to keep people their morale higher. Of course, Ukrainian government would not say, okay, today we lost these many hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers. It's not something, it's more about priorities. So they would rather say, oh, today we destroyed 100 Russian tanks. Of course, Ukrainian population right now, especially when it's being attacked, even if it's far away from the front line, they do need to hear these things. And sometimes war propaganda has a space in media sphere during the war, when the country is at war. But when it comes to objectivity, of course, there are bad and good journalists everywhere, and Norway as well, I'm sure.
Here as well, we have to admit.
Absolutely. But we have a lot of journalists with a lot of experience reporting on the war, who have been reporting on the war since 2014. As Maksym mentioned, of course, it's easier for Ukrainian journalists to report on this war because they do know the context, they do know the facts. But at the same time, it's more difficult for them to report on the war than sometimes international media, because they actually have less access because BBC and CNN and such, they are more prioritized when it comes to access.
Why?
Because they have a broader audiences, basically.
And more security, maybe, or
they also have more security because they have more funds, more sources. Ukrainian journalists have tiny salary, no health insurance. I've been working for 3 years at the front line without single day having health insurance because I couldn't afford it. Some of them don't have vests and helmets or medical kits. Of course, now those who really working on the front line, we have a very strong civil society in Ukraine, so we're raising money very quickly and getting them at least essential PPE. But still, of course, there are many young journalists and young fixers started working who never worked on the front line, never reported on the war. They also make mistakes, both concerning their own safety of their teams, also ethical mistakes. But yeah, it's not an ideal environment. It's war, so of course we're not 100% perfect. But who is? International media also coming, and they forget that people in Ukraine, they're not just stories, they're also people.
Yeah, they forget in what way, you mean?
In many ways, like asking questions from soldiers, how many people you killed, Ukrainian soldiers, or there are some pictures you can see after Borodyanka and these cities next to Kyiv were liberated. There was so much attention from international media that we had to have like a government organized buses to bring media to the city to take pictures of the destroyed city. And there are like 50 international journalists taking picture of a cat around destroyed city. Of course, also it's very important to consider how to report on the war. And whether maybe should you really go and take picture of the same or interview the same woman who has been interviewed 50 times already, who lost her child. Should you exactly get to that woman again, or should you maybe find another angle? This is also a big question on that nobody's really asking, how international media, their objectivity and their ethical considerations and standards.
Yeah, because I mean they meet so depraved people, sensitive sources. What do you feel about that, Maksym? Do you feel that the international media is just like bussing into a war zone and just, you know, doing whatever to get their story?
I think it depends on the media. It is very easy actually to find a dramatic story in Ukraine, especially in the occupied areas where every house, every family has its own story. And there are very good stories from Ukraine, and I agree that this with cat and the same pictures. It's but every media has its own audience, and maybe it is good to share the same story in many media for broader audience.
But just returning back to the objectivity, I mean, do you really feel that you can freely cover, for example, if the Ukrainian army committed war crime? Could you freely investigate such a thing?
We don't had such cases. At least I don't know about such cases. And I believe that Ukrainian army are not committing war crimes in Ukraine, especially because Ukrainian army is protecting Ukrainian people from those who are committing war crimes. And knowing Ukraine and knowing the level of our society and the level of our desire to be free and to be the first who will post something on Facebook, I believe that such stories that Ukrainian journalists will not cover something from society if it is a very important issue, even if it is something which is unpleasant for society.
Oleksandra, what do you think about that?
Regarding the war crimes and if Ukrainian army committed any war crimes, just common sense. There is no Ukrainian army in Russian territory. Who are they going to commit war crimes against their own people? No, doubtful. But I don't know this kind of information, of course. But I believe that we have quite a strong media environment since 2014, since we more or less got rid of the Russian influence and started really investing into our public broadcaster and developing and training journalists. We have professional journalists who will report and who are reporting critically against our own government and what's happening. Yeah, so. But right now, maybe I think there is like a national consensus that we're not reporting right now on something not important, like some kind of arguments between politicians, or if some small stories. That's not really something we have to prioritize because the resources are limited, and the main story in Ukraine now is war. So. Yeah.
It's all about the war.
But trust me, Ukrainians are not afraid of criticizing politicians. We have stories on YouTube Ukrainians throwing politicians into garbage bins by the parliament. So.
But I remember when the war broke out. I mean, we covered the war like minute by minute in Norwegian state broadcasting, and I think everybody, even including the journalists, were in a state of shock for like weeks, and in my case for many months. And it was all we could think about, you know, and the coverage was so massive. I haven't ever seen that, I think, in my career. But I'm wondering, what about now? How do you feel that the media coverage is right now of the war, Maksym?
Is not enough. For sure, is not enough. I mean, of the attention of international media is not, and it is understandable because it is over 8 months since the beginning of full-scale war, and we have everyday shellings, everyday ruined buildings, everyday someone die. And for foreigner it may seem as a routine, but for documentation it is extremely important to cover and to record every single case of these crimes, to be able to write the history, because history is creating right now. And we cannot close our eyes and stop thinking about war and writing about war.
Yeah, Oleksandra, what do you think would be the consequences if the attention decreases?
Oh, the consequences would be dire, and not just for Ukraine, but for the whole democratic world. Because if we will give up on Ukraine, you can give up on Norway then as well, because Russia will come for the rest of the democratic world. So I think the attention should be there, and journalists should go to Ukraine and report from the field, and we should be careful of not pushing Ukraine as an international journalist, not pushing Ukraine to the negotiated table with Russia because our electricity bills are too high, because it would be the same as you would put the rape victim and the aggressor on the negotiating table and say, so make peace, we're tired of this war.
Yeah.
So I think,
is that what you're scared about?
Yeah, that would be the worst case scenario.
Mm. So I want to, hear if you have some questions from the audience. So please, is there a microphone we can have to, or I mean the...
Can you please use the microphone so that the people are watching can also hear you?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm a retired military psychiatrist. I have been taking part in a military maneuver, actually, in Ukraine about 20 years ago on behalf of NATO. That's my modest background for this. An American colleague of mine has written a book called Achilles in Vietnam, where he shows that every atrocity that the Americans committed in Vietnam was already described 2,500 years ago in Homer's history about the war against Troy. And you know, the first book in European literature actually was a textbook of what war does to man. So when you say you don't know about any war atrocity or war crime committed by your soldiers, it may be that you don't want to know. Now,
we want to know everything. We want to know everything because it is our country and it is our work to know what is happening in our country.
I commuted between Serbia and Croatia in 1991, and I saw that professionals lost their role identity within a couple of weeks. Physicians, for example, became no longer physicians, they became Serbs or Croats. And it was very scaring, actually. But I have three questions to you. If Putin's hybrid warfare, the information war, is not to convince us that we should believe his version, but it's to confuse us about what is the truth, that there are several truths. You know, the conspiration theories, that in the end we do not really know who we should trust. How should we meet that? My second question is about the independence of a journalist. Whether you are able to remain an independent journalist, or whether you, in the end, if you have to also to be a Ukrainian citizen. We know that in 1941, if we had known the bad situation that England was in, it would have been very bad for morale. You know, we call this adaptive denial. Sometimes the truth is harmful, the full truth. And I think that's a dilemma for an independent journalist, that in the end there are certain things you have to be careful in reporting about. So I think in the end it's an illusion to believe that when a country is at war, that we are able actually to maintain a sort of a professional neutrality. Well, that's my question, you know. So it means that if you are informed about your Ukrainian soldiers also committing war crime, will you then be able, or should you report it? From the news reports we have in Norwegian media, I have the feeling that we are idealizing to some extent now the Ukrainian support for the war and the belittling of the difficulties that the population really is facing. Thank you.
I will answer not as a journalist, maybe I will answer more as a human rights defender regarding war crimes. I believe that every crime must be prosecuted, must be fairly prosecuted, and perpetrators must be punished. It doesn't matter if they are Russians or if they are Ukrainians. There are no nations of good people and nations of bad people. Every single country has thieves and etc. etc. For journalists in Ukraine, there is a freedom for covering any topic. Of course, it depends on their own morale, their feelings, but I'm not sure that we are afraid of covering such topics. Me personally, I'm not afraid to write what I want to write. Maybe because I didn't touch such topics as potential war crime of Ukraine on the territory of Ukraine, but we are in a good level of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, comparing to what we had 30 years ago, and since 2014, the media environment is really increased in a million times.
I just wanted to follow, because I believe you also asked about when do can you distinguish between being a journalist or being a citizen at war? What happens to a journalist when you become a citizen of war and everything is about supporting the army, supporting the defense, fighting for your country, basically. Oleksandra, you also wanted to
comment regarding both your questions and answer your questions with a question to you. If allegedly the Ukrainian army is committing any war crimes, if that would be the case, why Russia does not allow any international journalists in the occupied territories? Because it would be very beneficial for them to do so, but they don't. So that, I think, kind of talks a lot about the situation and the independence of also how. And regarding the question that you were asking about if we can separate our roles as citizens and journalists, I don't even think that these roles should be separated in a way, because there is space for both. In my experience, also, I wouldn't write on something if I know that I would be biased. I would rather self-censor and not do that. And that's why I also worked a lot with international media, because I was, as a fixer, I would give them a word if I know that I would be biased. But at the same time, sometimes international media don't report on the things that we want them to report on. More in-depth stories, not just how many people died, but why, what is the war actually about, the values, and so on.
Okay, let's take another question.
My name is Kjersti Løken Stavrum. I'm president of Norwegian PEN, and I'm very happy that you're here to tell the stories. I think I'm not the only one that you make a huge impression on. I have a question regarding press freedom in Ukraine. I seem to remember that Ukraine was ranked about on place 100 on the World Press Freedom Index before the war, mainly due to the oligarchs owning media. And Oleksandra, you were touching upon that you were on a better journey within the media, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on, say, if the war was over now then, how would you think the media landscape remap if there were to be peace? Who do you think would be the forces to develop new media in Ukraine after this war? Best guess.
Funnily enough, due to the war that started in 2014, and thanks to Russia, we have free and independent media in Ukraine, because since Maidan Revolution, we grew as a nation, and we created new media that are powerful, that are working for public good, and was skillful and professionally trained journalists. And we have been also working on I forgot the words in English, but improving our public broadcaster and taking experience from Germany, from Deutsche Welle, and so on, collaborating with our international partners to create a strong media environment because we need it. Partially because, as you mentioned, many TV channels have been and still are owned by oligarchs who have political influence and who translate that political influence and to the audiences and so on. But of course, we're not ideal. Ukraine has many internal problems we need to address, but it's very hard to do so when you're being attacked. If we were just left alone, and we could focus on development and getting rid of corruption and political influence in the media, but I think after the war is over, our media environment will be probably even stronger than it was before.
And you also told me something interesting about how the war is fundamentally changing equality between sexes and the conditions for female journalists, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are, at least before February, there were some women journalists working and reporting on the war on the front line, some of my colleagues, but there were not as many as now, partially due to, again, men going to fight. As they are obliged to, and women can do that by their own choice. But many women decided to stay, and even though they can leave the country, but they decided to stay and report on the war. And I think this is a good thing. We also see more women joining the army. So Ukraine had and still has quite conservative gender roles, but in a crisis like this, they are changing. Definitely. And I think that's also a good trend in a very bad situation.
Okay, so we're going to take more questions. Is that maybe the last question, or I don't know how much time we have left? Okay, yeah. 2 more.
So thank you for sharing your thoughts and testimonies, both of you. My name is Ingeborg Kvarna. I work for PEN Norway. And I know the PEN movement is not just about free speech, but also promoting literature. And I know that PEN Ukraine, our sister organization, you have made a list of recommended books, both fiction and non-fiction, that you want us to read in order to increase our knowledge about the Ukrainian culture and history. But the list is long. So I just wanted, could you here now recommend one book of fiction and one book of non-fiction that we, the Norwegian readers, should start reading? Thank you.
It's a very good question on the one book. I recommend everyone abroad to read the history books about Ukraine, to have a deeper knowledge of what is happening now, to have a better understanding, and maybe it can be a book of Serhiy Plokhy or Yaroslav Grytsak, who are both of them are prominent historians and did just amazing job writing their history books. Maybe and regarding non-fiction, we have many travel writers, and Ukraine is very picturesque and beautiful and diverse, and we have like Maksym Sytnikov, who is writing about travels, or we have a project Ukrainer, which is doing materials and books, writing books about different regions of Ukraine. So I can advise you to read something that will open Ukraine for you from different sides.
So I am afraid the names were a bit difficult. Maybe you can publish on your website like 2 recommendations. There were many questions. Now we have time for one more. Was that it, or more? I see 2. Can we 2? Okay. We're up for 2. Okay, so it was you first. Do you want to have my microphone, or you want to? Yeah, you can go up there. So. Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming. It's been very, very informative. I just wanted to ask quickly, because you mentioned that the international media, they sometimes come and they take pictures of this cat or whatever, and they will all focus on the same story. And I was wondering if there's an aspect of the war, with you guys being Ukrainian, that you feel haven't been told or is missing from the international media? That you feel like they're focusing on the wrong aspects, or if there's a story missing?
I guess I can answer partially your question. I think because of how media production is working and how the news are made, and the news values, it's about how many people died, when it happened, and so on. So it limits a lot what we know about the war and why the war is there. And I think it's very important to have more meaningful. Of course, we still should report on the victims and so on, but we should also report and talk about what values are at stake. What is the war about? Is it about taking territories, or is it about destroying a nation that's trying to be independent, or is it about destroying a culture? I think it's all about it's important to explain this a bit better, because then we help people to understand. Basically.
I have just a very simple example. Have you ever heard about Volodymyr Vakulenko, who is a Ukrainian writer and who was abducted? No, but almost nobody. And this is an example of a story which must be told in all the world, because it is a children writer who is abducted and maybe tortured, and maybe he is already killed. Maybe he is one of these 447 tortured and killed people. We still don't know. We still are waiting for DNA results, and but international foreign media are not covering these stories.
Or the same with historians who are being arrested for being historians. I mean, it should tell you something if a historian is put in Russian prison. Probably it's a very important part of this war.
Thank you. There are 3 facts about Ukrainian history that ought to be better known. One is the 5 million Ukrainians who were killed in famine in the 20s and 30s. If that had been known in the West, maybe Holocaust wouldn't have happened. And that was the denial was due to one American journalist. And you know the story, yeah. The second is that the 2 important concepts in international law, genocide and crimes against humanity, have been coined by 2 professors at the Faculty of Law in Lviv, Lemberg. And this was practiced in the Nuremberg trials. And I think the world actually is not aware of the strong impact that Ukraine has had on international laws when it comes to war.
Okay.
So I would encourage you to make that more known.
That's a good point. Do you want to comment upon that, or we can take the next question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very important, and we're talking about it. And the reason why nobody knows about Ukrainian history, Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian culture, because we have been living under the influence of an empire like Russia. And for some reason, even in academia, when you look into post-colonial countries, they're talking a lot about it. And we only now, after 9 years of war, and only now we're starting to talk about Ukraine in the West as post-colonial country. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about Ukraine in academia, and not as a Russia or Russian influence, but actually as a separate country, right, with its own
Okay, we're going to have you and then you at the end, and then we're not taking more questions. Yes.
Amund Myklebust er mitt navn. Gammel journalist. Understrek gammel. Det er veldig interessant å være her. And of course, we have to take it in English. I'm a journalist. And it's interesting for many reasons. We are actually related, if we go back 1,000 years, to Kievan Rus. So it's family meeting tonight. I will tell about a small project with journalist students in Ukraine. Some of them in Taurida National University and some in other Ukrainian universities, about 40 together. And they make war diary, war documented by young journalists. They got support from Free Speech, Fritt Ord, a couple of months ago. And the link, I hope you will notice, truthfulreporting.org. Truthfulreporting.org. And this project goes on, and it's very interesting to share it with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that sharing. That was an interesting link to check out for everybody. So we'll have the last question from Vibeke Løkkeberg, famous filmmaker, I might add, here in Norway.
Thank you for coming. I am a filmmaker, yes, and I've made 2 movies in war, like Tears of Gaza, in Gaza, and also in Yugoslavia, 93. And what I'm thinking of, which is not mentioned at all in this war, is my reason to make a movie in Yugoslavia was that there was three people with different religion who were fighting together, who had before been friends. And I thought, what happens to this mixed marriage and to the children of this mixed marriage, to the women, which has a father, which is very angry that her daughter is married to, like a Serb, a Croat, you remember. And I found so much terrible in this case, and then I wonder what will happen. Because you're also mixed people. You have marriage between Russia and your own country, and you have children. Where are they? What will happen to them? Or have you been interested in this aspect? Because I would think after, maybe the war is over, you will have this long going, and it will be terrible. So I just want to mention this. Thank you.
Yes, Maksym.
I think that the war in Ukraine is not like it was in Yugoslavia, because now Ukrainians are not only like citizens of Ukraine or people who were born in Ukraine or who has Ukrainian blood. It is a political decision to be Ukrainian, because we also have many Russians in armed forces of Ukraine who are fighting against Russia. We have entire battalions from people from Belarus who are fighting with Ukraine, and the same with families who are living in Ukraine. If one partner is, for example, Russian, another is Ukrainian, you can be still like you support values, because it is like it's not only war of 2 countries. It is something bigger. It is war of values. It is. I didn't hear you well.
You're telling me that also Russians are in the Ukraine military fighting?
No, they don't have to go. If they are not citizens of Ukraine, they don't have to go to fight. But there are several examples of foreigners. We have foreign battalions of people from all around the world who are fighting for not only for Ukraine. They are fighting for democracy, for freedom of speech, for liberation of the country, for preventing the World War III.
Can you come up here and take the microphone for the streaming?
Does it mean that what we hear about the hate between Ukrainian and Russian, that it's not existing? Because I'm talking about, when you come down to basic, this is people. The Russian language is not anymore very much accepted. Is that right? That goes also into the Russian people and the Ukrainian people. I'm trying not to be, not on side or anything. I'm just trying to come down to this hate who will kill innocent people in this war. Not on the front, but in between people who are married and the innocent children. This is what I'm trying to go into.
I will say that it is a big difference between Russians who are living in Russia and Russians who are living in Ukraine for 30 years, who have children in Ukraine, who are learning in Ukrainian schools and speaking Ukrainian language, and they are politically Ukrainians, and we consider them as Ukrainians, and they usually support Ukraine. But in the same time, we have Ukrainians who collaborate with Russians in occupied territories. So it is not. You don't have to be. It's not like if you are Ukrainian, you are a good guy. If you have another passport, you are bad. Everyone can choose the side on this war.
Okay. Oleksandra.
I just wanted to mention regarding the Russian language in Ukraine. I'm a Russian speaker. It's my first mother tongue is Russian because I was born in Donetsk. And I have no problem speaking Russian in Ukraine. But since February, I decided that I still speak Russian with my mom, who doesn't speak Ukrainian because she was not born in Ukraine. But I decided to make a choice and switch to Ukrainian because now I don't want to speak the same language, people who hate my culture and want to kill every Ukrainian. I don't want to speak the same language with them. And I don't want to continue this long line of imperialistic oppression of my country. So yes, there is hate between Russians and Ukrainians, and it will be there and you cannot do anything about it. It's not that we have a happy marriage with Russians and then we have children. No, it's more like a marriage with an abusive father who is trying to murder you and doesn't let you leave. This more kind of appropriate comparison here.
Well, on behalf of PEN Norway, I think I'm going to end this evening now. This debate will not end. You can keep on talking, and you can stick to the subject, and we're going to be talking about it for a long, long time, and hopefully the solution will be there one day. And thank you so much for coming. Hege, thank you for beautiful moderating of this conversation. We're going to give you Rabalder. It's the story of Norwegian PEN and the story of freedom of speech in Norway for the last 100 years, because this is our 100 years anniversary. And it's not always a pretty story. I mean, freedom of expression has to be fought for every day. And also, Mika, you know that now you can walk around in the streets of Oslo, but there were times when you couldn't. So, and to our honored guest from Ukraine, we have a poetry collection written by Ilham Çomak. And Ilham Çomak is an honorary member of PEN Norway. He is from Turkey. He's in jail. He's been in jail for 28 years. And the last 7 years, he's been living in solitary confinement. And during those years in jail, he's written 9 books of poetry. And this is the last one, and it's been translated by Caroline Stockford, who is our Turkish advisor, and we work a lot towards Turkey, as we do towards Ukraine and towards many other countries, Belarus, Afghanistan. I mean, there's so much we have work that we can do, and I hope he will join PEN in fighting for freedom of expression all over, and for fight for freedom of those who actually dare to use their voice. And I'm going to end this evening, with just a few words from Ilham Chumak, written in jail, where he writes about all the things that are not there and the things he has not seen for the last 28 years. There are no turnings of the season, no eclipses of the moon, no earth, no plants in their simple elegance, no cat's paw, no sweat-drenched headlong of a horse, no curtain for breeze to life, no mouldering bunches of grapes. Life separated from the sun. There is no direction here, but there is a way out. There is always a way out. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.